My name's Lindsay Tanner. I'm the Minister for Finance and Deregulation, and with me, of course, is John Keane, author of The Life and Death of Democracy, and we're going to be engaging in a conversation with you this evening. Delighted to be with you again. There may be one or two of you here in the audience who will know that I was here last night as part of the Q&A program on the ABC, so I'm starting to feel familiar with the place. I've had the good fortune to actually be able to read John's book. I've read all of it. It's quite long, but it's a delightful book and fascinating because of the sweep of the canvas of the book, going from the earliest days of known human civilization right up to the modern day and spanning all continents. And Australia figures reasonably significantly. I'm sure the fact that John is actually Australian, although he left Australia quite a long time ago, had nothing to do with the fact that we figure prominently and usually with a reasonable degree of positive description. But it is a tremendous book. It is a book really worth reading, and if you want to have some evidence that I put my money where my mouth is, the head of my department has recently left the Finance Department to move to run the Defence Department, and we had a little going away drinks for him a week or so ago, and as the departing gift for him, I gave him a copy of John's book. That's how highly I think of it. So can I ask you please to put your hands together to welcome John Keane for an introduction.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was a Greek gift, if ever I've heard of one. So, ladies and gentlemen, citizens, citizenesses, as they would say in the early 19th century, it's wonderful to be here. I'm particularly interested in your, Lindsay, your comments and complaints about the book. It's an attempt to write in a different way, democratically even, a sort of open text, a new history of democracy. The last one was written during the 19th century, towards the last quarter of the 19th century. A lot of things have changed since then. Conceived around 1998-99, and took, needless to say, a lot of my life, a lot of sweat, a lot of difficulty, a lot of pain, a lot of confusion, and also a tremendous amount of joy. You know this word serendipity, beautiful English word. I have a new definition of serendipity, which is that you slave your insides out, trying to craft a new history and to say new things and to add with precision as much detail and characters and sense of irony. And it comes out in the UK in early June, in the midst of the gravest parliamentary corruption scandal since the early 19th century. And, even the title, The Life and Death of Democracy, had a great resonance, and it got off to a great start. So, I'm very glad to be here, and I'm looking forward to Lindsay's thoughts about democracy and its history.
Well, my first question for John is that his primary thesis or initial thesis in the book is that the view that we all have that democracy was invented by the ancient Greeks is in fact inaccurate, and there is evidence to suggest democratic forms of governance predating ancient Greece, and that this has been overlooked by history. So I wonder if you could first just outline for us why we're wrong if we think of ancient Greece as the first cradle of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, one of the subtexts of the book is that it's important for democrats in the 21st century, wherever they are on the face of the earth, to have a much stronger sense of historicity, putting in, one of the aims of this book is to put a pair of eyes in the back of heads of readers. When you do that, you're forced to realize all kinds of things of which you were unaware. It certainly teaches you to be much more sensitive to the novelty of our times, and also to the roots of things that we take for granted. And here's one. The idea that the dogma, I would say, that it all started in Athens is chronic. You find it in most textbooks on democracy. I think if you talk to taxi drivers, you talk to people in cafes, if you were to ask, they tell you, yeah, it's a kind of idea that started, I think, probably in Greece and in Athens. In fact, that view is a 19th century invention, and I detail in the book the work of historians who try to revive memories of Athens in a period when largely they'd been broken, smashed up, and forgotten. And in particular, the work of an English banker, polymath, also deeply involved in politics, one of the co-founders of University College London, George Grote, after whom a street is named in, I'm having trouble with my ear, after whom a street in Adelaide is named. And George Grote writes a 12-volume history of Greece in which this thesis is basically put, and it had tremendous effect. What I try to do in this book is to look at the archaeological evidence of the last generation, half generation. And two things are very striking. One is that the family of terms that has at its center demokratia, which was thought until quite recently to be probably an Athenian invention, probably sometime during the 5th century BCE. It turns out that there's a family of terms that are very closely related to demos, to demokratia and so on, that date from roughly 1500 BCE, and we know about them now because they appear in a language called Linear B, which was only decoded beginning in the early 1950s. And what you find are nouns and verbs. For example, the damo is in the ancient Mycenaean civilization is a group of people who once had property, who lost their property and become powerless. Well, this family of terms passes into classical Greek. So this is one way in which I think the whole story of the origins of democracy needs to be revised. But perhaps more important, a blow against Orientalism, we could say, is the clear evidence that assemblies, institutions where people gather as equals to decide things, to decide who gets what, when, and how, the birth of politics, assemblies are undoubtedly an invention of the towns of ancient Syria, Mesopotamia. And we owe this insight to the work of, initially, of a Danish archaeologist named Thorkild Jacobsen. He worked for many years in Chicago. And what you see from the evidence is that assemblies flourish from around 2500 BCE. That is 2,000 years before Athens. And they spring up, it's a sweet irony, or bittersweet irony, in Syria, Mesopotamia, in countries that are today Syria, Iraq, and Iran. I found that rather amusing as I was writing this during the Bush years. These assemblies are transported partly to the east into what is today Pakistan and Western India, and they're transported to the west through the Phoenician world into the Greek world. And what the Greeks did was claim assemblies as their own invention. So, to put it simply, the lamp of the first phase of democracy, assembly-based democracy, is lit, or was lit in the East. And that's evidence-based. But I think what the effect of this is to break this 19th century view that the origins of the West is traceable to Athens, to the Greek world, to Hellas, and that democracy, too, is a Western invention. In fact, the evidence suggests that it has hybrid origins, and that if the basic unit of early democracy is the assembly, then this is an Eastern gift to the world. And that opens up a sense, I think, that democracy belongs to many more peoples than to peoples of the so-called West.
You go on in the book to suggest that where you have the establishment of, I suppose you'd call it organised democracy, and ancient Athens is the first example, but there are modern examples, that there is something of an innate tendency for that to then be followed by military adventurism and by the organised state that is being run, at least on some democratic basis, for reasons that I'm interested to hear. has a propensity to then look outward and seek to conquer neighbours, supposedly for the purpose of persuading them how to run themselves better, i.e. be democratic, but in practice, of course, being essentially imperial in nature. How strong do you think the evidence is to connect those two?
Well, it's shocking for anybody who thinks that democracy equals non-violent power sharing among citizens, that democracy is essentially pacific, because the evidence is very clear that in the case of Athens, which of course becomes the major imperial power, as you say, in the Greek world during the 5th century, it comes as a surprise and a shock to find that actually the democracy is shot through with military ethos. And many of the problems that the Athenian polis, that the Paniques, the assembly, has to handle are to do with war. Athens is at war for most of the 5th century. There are very brief periods when it is not. And most shocking of all, it should be for us, I think, is that when you look at the justifications of democracy, why is democracy such a good thing in the ancient Athenian assembly, there are no democratic thinkers, by the way, who make arguments for it. The arguments you have to reconstruct from the speeches, from poetry, from plays. But when you look at the leading, I would say, dominant justification for democratia in Athens, it is that it makes we, Athenians, powerful, militarily strong in the Greek world. That's pretty shocking for us. And that is not to say that democracy is essentially a militaristic ideal. But in the Athenian case, it's undoubtedly infected by the spirit of war. One of the things that I try to do in the book is introduce the rather scanty evidence that we have, but nevertheless evidence it is, of up to 100 democracies in the Greek world, some of them older than Athens. This is another way of getting at George Grote. In other words, to say, well, actually, we ought to look at the pluralism of democracies in the 6th and 5th and 4th centuries. And it's interesting on the question of war and militarism and violence that during the course of the 4th century, there is a league form called the Arcadian League, which you can think about as, in a way, doing something similar to what the European Union is doing, trying to put an end to war by putting stops on the constant rivalry of states in this Greek world. And what the Arcadian League does is form something like a federated or confederated polity. It has a capital, megalopolis, and it tries to pool military resources for protecting a number of democracies, and it also produces arguably the first cross-border assembly in the history of democracy. It survived for rather a long time. It was often in tension with Athens, but it shows that the early democracies, assembly democracies, had this capacity to deal with war, to problematize war, to hold at arm's length stasis, this sense of decline and degeneration and decadence that would inevitably engulf democracy. So we need to know more about these democracies. Unfortunately, most archaeological resources, the digs, have concentrated on Athens. The American school at Athens has been disproportionately resourced. So it dug up the facts that confirm the 19th century Grote view that it all started in Athens. A good deal more digging and resourcing of digging throughout the Greek world, I think, would greatly change our picture. And I try in the book to introduce the evidence that the fresh evidence that we have.
There are many who see the rise of Christianity as having a significant role in the emergence of the values base which underpins what we see as modern democracy, and in particular the notion that all human beings are equal and that society should be run on the basis of love and harmony rather than inequality and violence. But you introduce in the book an interesting angle with respect to the rise of Christianity, which I think bears further elaboration, and that is that the early Christian churches were the first religions to have designated specific responsibilities for particular office holders as part of how they organised themselves, and that this was in some respects a precursor to structures that enable democracy. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's a long and complicated history, and on a Friday night you might not be in the mood for talking about Christianity and democracy, but never mind other religions' contributions, including, for example, Islam, which I try to give as much prominence as I can in the book. But there's no doubt that the spirit of Christianity played an enormous role in the birth of a second phase of democracy, what came to be called by the last quarter of the 18th century representative democracy. The Greeks, by the way, had no word for representation or representative. They literally could not think in their universe of discourse of democracy as periodic elections of representatives who would, like you, who would be periodically put to the test and booted out, unlike you.
So far, so good.
And so what I try to do in the book is to look at the various overlapping, complicated processes, the fascinating characters, the ironies that fed the invention, the mutation that came to be called representative democracy. And one of the earliest contributions of the Christian world in Europe, medieval Christianity. By the way, the distinction between modernity, or the modern world, and the medieval world doesn't make very much sense when it comes to looking at the history of democracy, because many of the so-called modern institutions, like liberty of the press, constitutional conventions, the secret ballot, trial by jury, have the mark of medieval Christianity stamped all over them. You mentioned the case of office holding. It's not everybody's cup of tea to talk about offices, but it's really a very basic invention, a gift of Christianity to what later comes to be representative democracy. And the idea is this: the church takes over what's left of the Roman Empire, and it, in effect, is the central organizing institution of medieval Europe. And it has, from top down, the problem of governing itself. And there are many things that happen in this medieval church, including the invention of councils. These are councils of representatives whose job is to actually govern the church. And as you know, the split, the irreversible split that happened in the church, had to do with whether popes could or should be elected by councils, or whether, top down, God's gift, the pope would simply be anointed as an uncontestable leader, spiritual and temporal, of the church. The church, in trying to govern itself, is a laboratory in which the whole idea of office holding happens. What is an office? When you think about it, it is what the church does is effectively invent this separation between people and the roles that they play, so that at various levels in the church, the bishops down to the monks and friars, are seen as holding offices. That is, they play a role within the church, but they do not own that role, and they are not identical with that role. And, more than that, the church infects roles. It defines roles in terms of duties and entitlements. So, according to medieval Christianity, you can hold an office which has a spiritual role in the church, and a functional role. But if you violate the norms of the church, then you lose the entitlements, land or tithes or gifts and so on. You lose those entitlements. And my idea is that it's this invention of office holding on the condition that the office holder does not think that she owns that office, and that the office holder can be kicked out, removed from office. That is a basic invention, later a gift to the whole world of representative democracy. I say in the book, I couldn't quote it because it would have cost several £1,000s to quote for the rights. But, there is a famous line from Bob Dylan that you may think there's a big gap between medieval Christianity and Bob Dylan, but there's a famous line from Dylan about how there are times when even the President of the United States has to stand naked before the people. The idea is there that the President of the United States is not identical with the role of President. Barack Obama doesn't own the presidency. George Bush thought he did at certain times, I had the feeling. But the principle of representative democracy is that it insists on the differentiation, and therefore you can kick the buggers out. That's basically a very long-winded way of saying that a grand irony in the history of democracy, and there are many of them, is that medieval Christianity gave us the ability to think about office holding and the rules and conditions of office holding. I think it's really interesting.
Now, moving on, you've mentioned the United States, and one of the more facile myths that has prevailed about democracy and the history of democracy, of course, has been that it was invented in the United States in 1776, and that essentially the USA was the world's first democratic state. Now, clearly there are major deficiencies with this argument, both with respect to what it ignores elsewhere, but also with respect to the nature of what the US was at that time. In my view, the US at that time was essentially a carbon copy of the British Constitution, except with an elected king, or a semi-elected king, and that one of the interesting things about the United States now is that the relative distribution of powers between the legislature and the executive has a certain amount of similarity with its equivalent in late 18th century Britain, from which it's drawn. And because of the structure of the Constitution, it has not evolved into something anywhere near as different as the British Constitution, unwritten as it is, has. So I'm interested to hear your view on the significance for the evolution of democracy of the American Revolution and the establishment of the United States.
Yeah. In 1989, in the spring of 1989, Francis Fukuyama famously wrote this essay called The End of History, and it subsequently became a book, and he won world notoriety for that thesis. The timing was impeccable. If you look at that essay, again, you will find within it exactly this presumption that liberal democracy, symbolized by the institutions and the spirit of American liberal democracy, have their roots in the events of 1776. And as you know, the Fukuyama thesis, at the point at which the Soviet empire is collapsing and the velvet revolutions, as they come to be called, are erupting, managed to get the timing absolutely right. And here the idea is that liberal, Western, liberal representative democracy is basically an American gift to the modern world. I think that's factually incorrect. I think it's nonsense. And I spend a couple of hundred pages getting my axe out, or scalpel. And for a lot of reasons, including, these gifts of medieval Christianity to the whole idea of representative democracy, which the American revolutionaries had absorbed and took over. But many institutions had already been invented: liberty of the press, trial by jury, constitutional conventions, office holding, etc. These all predated 1776. And you are also right about the interdependence of the unwritten British Constitution and events in the colonies. But the main difficulty is that if you look carefully at the constitutional debates from just before the Declaration of Independence through to 1787, democracy is a dirty word. And I've looked very carefully, and you'll find that there is virtually nobody who, among the so-called founding fathers, who put together a constitutional package that Madison calls a compound republic, large territorial federation where there is a written constitution, unlike in Britain, and where there is provision for power sharing and elections. When you actually look in detail at this, you see that none of the architects of the Constitution, in all of the constitutional debate, has any affection for democracy. That's a paradox, and that's a very interesting clue. It turns out that it's, I think, much better to think of the American Revolution as a Republican breakthrough, but it was championed by and underpinned by actually landed aristocratic, gentlemanly American colonist types, men, who, when they spoke endlessly, as they did about the people, the term is repeated endlessly in the constitutional debates. It's a kind of phantomic people, because when they mean the people, they mean themselves, yes. And it's only really in the years 1792, early 1793, that the word democracy comes into the American Republic. It's a gift of the French ambassador. Actually, he comes and he agitates, saying, in France we have a revolution, and we speak a lot about démocratie. And very quickly there springs up in America the first Republican democratic societies. Some of them are called democratic societies, and they spring up in defense of the French Revolution. It's the beginning of the origins of the Democratic Party. And it's only because of Jefferson, the struggle to institutionalize a rotation of power, that a multi-party system is born. And it's only in the 1820s, in the Andrew Jackson period, that the word democracy begins to grip large numbers of Americans, and a whole 19th century process begins of trying to democratize the American Constitution. So I think Fukuyama, got it all wrong historically. This is not to, one last word, it's not to somehow deny the extraordinary qualities of the American 19th century struggle for democracy. It's a really remarkable episode of doing many, many things, and also having a civil war about the meaning of democracy. But it's also, one last comment, it's also the birth of representative democracy in America goes hand in hand with the birth of empire. And that bedevils the United States until today.
I'll get to the French Revolution, first French Revolution, in a minute, but
we're doing rather well, I think.
We're
covering thousands of years.
We've managed to get through several centuries in about 5 minutes here, which is pretty good going.
Yeah, more than most.
I'm actually something of a fan of Fukuyama, and I've met him a number of times, and I think, and I accept your critique of his American centrism. Mm-hmm. I've just created a new term, but I think you understand what I mean. And this is something of a deviation, but it strikes me that the end of history is possibly the most misrepresented thesis in kind of modern politics, because Fukuyama's real argument was to say that there were no longer any contestants on the field of intellectual legitimacy or moral legitimacy, other than liberal democracy, so that there would still be authoritarian governments, but that the collapse of communism meant that there was no longer any vaguely credible moral alternative that had legitimacy as an alternative to liberal democratic rule. And of course, that is actually, it may sound like hair-splitting, but that is actually quite different from the perception that has been advanced about Fukuyama, so that it's a much subtler thing that says, yeah, we'll still have dictatorships, but what we are witnessing is the death of the last form of dictatorship that had any claim to an underlying moral legitimacy that could be juxtaposed against the competing moral legitimacy of democratic rule. How do you respond to that?
You're right about that nuance, and he's often misunderstood. But I think that I have two objections to Fukuyama's view about especially the post-45 period. One is that I think after 1945, beginning above all with India, the language of institutions of democracy begin to travel and begin to take root. There is a kind of indigenization of the language and institutions of democracy, and the first great breakthrough is India. And I think, to put it simply, the character, the dynamics of Indian democracy are not describable in terms of, nor the leading ideals of Indian democracy are describable as liberal democracy. I think it's something different. And in the book, I bang the drum about Fukuyama and others actually misdescribing post-1945 real-world democracy, because of course there are the so-called liberal democracies of the American kind, but Indian democracy or democracy in Taiwan or democracy in South Africa is not driven by these or guided by these ideals. So that's one objection. The other is that it seems to me the phrase liberal democracy is a bit of a zombie phrase. I mean, it makes us feel good, or some of us feel good. But I think that actually it has a certain soporific quality, and it has the effect of actually blinding us, numbing us, silencing our thoughts about new challenges to democracy that are actually developing and gathering pace in our own times. I think you can identify a number of new trends, new challenges to the visionary leading ideals of liberal democracy. Fukuyama, it's true, says, in Russia there might be a rebirth of great Russian chauvinism. There are a few hints of that kind. And he says that the world of Islam, might not go along with liberal democracy. But I think, descriptively, this is the second objection, we are living in times where there are actually now intellectual, spiritual, if you like, never mind institutional challenges to the Fukuyama conception of democracy. What are they? What is going on in Italy, Berlusconismo, is something new. And it's something worrying. And I don't think it's liberal, and I don't think it's democratic. If you're Slavoj Žižek, you talk about it as a species of authoritarian capitalism. I think it's more than that. It's something new. It's a kind of degraded form of parliamentary democracy where, you have to own all the media. But it involves the destruction of constitutional government, the destruction of multi-party system, the weakening of parliament. Berlusconi says often, why do we need a parliament in Italy? And turning politics into a kind of low-grade showbiz.
It's a kind of soft authoritarian.
Yes, so this is a challenger. We have in China, let's say, a kind of Hu Jintaoism. Actually, better call it the harmonious society. And that's a code word for a whole cluster of ideals. Let's stick on the Fukuyama point. A whole cluster of ideals that actually represent a challenge to liberal democracy as he understands it. And it is just possible that that will succeed. And thirdly, I spot if you look at recent Iranian events, you can certainly see an authoritarian alternative to democracy that cynically uses the Quran and the Hadith, spiritual ideals, to legitimate terror and violence and, bashing people up. These are at least, I think, three options that have developed. And you could say, well, Frank, he wrote this in 1989, but he still to this day says, I cannot see any plausible, viable ideals that could rival democracy. I think this is not true, and I think we better watch out for these trends.
Well, China, of course, is run by engineers, so as Anglo-society...
Party engineers.
Well, in fact, I think 8 out of 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Central Committee of the Politburo are engineers.
No.
And at one stage a few years ago, it was 9 out of 9.
They like harmony.
That's right.
Well.
That's right. Still, some of you would argue that's better than lawyers, of which I used to be one many, many years ago, who tend to figure prominently in our system of government.
Used to be farmers when I was in Australia.
That's right, yes. In the good old days, it was farmers. The French Revolution, 1789 to 93. Now, I semi-flippantly in the past have described this as perhaps the single most important political event in modern human history. Now, that's a slight degree of exaggeration, but nonetheless, I do, as having been a student of it, do regard it as hugely important because of the intense eruption of commitment to the principle of human equality and participation in government and tearing down of artificial and tradition-based hierarchies, which seems to me to be central to the idea of democracy. How significant was that event?
Well, highly significant, but once again, the French Revolution is about the invention of representative democracy in territorial state form. So the caveat is that lots of things happened before the French Revolution. Not only the gifts, if you like, of medieval Christianity to the birth of various crucial institutions that became vital in the French Republic, but also some pretty dramatic events. Depends whether you're, have Francophile tendencies or not, but, the thunk of a king's head on an execution platform in full view of an awe-struck public, Charles I, is a very major development in the history of representative democracy, and it, of course, fills monarchs with fear elsewhere in Europe. And if you're Dutch, you point out that actually the Dutch very early did many things that were later played out in the French Revolution. And if you're American, you say, well, actually, 1776 was, the beginning of the end of monarchic despotism and so on. I think one has to have a sense of it. But we come to the drama, the excitement, the poetry, the fear, the loathing, the joy, the excitement that the French Revolution generated. The historical record is very clear about this. What did it contribute? It's, for me, in the life and death of democracy, an example, the second example of democracy turning violent and militaristic. Yes, it's true that the constitution that is written, the principled debates, the talk of égalité, fraternité, liberté, and so on, hugely important. And it's true, it's like an earthquake throughout Europe, and wider than that. But it's also a revolution that very quickly turns sour, in which terror is central, and in which there begins to be a militarization of the revolution that has European-wide effects. And this darker side of the French Revolution, I think, ought to be taken into account. It's not just exceptional. It's not just somehow nothing to do with representative democracy. If you think that the terror has nothing to do with representative democracy, you should have a look at the 5 minutes or so speech that Robespierre gave to the Convention in, I think, January 1793, where he gives a talk that says what we're doing in France is different than what the Greek world knew. Our form of democracy is representative. We elect representatives. Our form of democracy is happening in a large territorial state framework, and our form of democracy requires the extension of democracy into the social domain. So it's not just to do with government. It will transform the habits, the minds, the hearts of all French citizens. And he says in this 5-minute speech that it therefore requires terror. And when you read that, you think, God. It was this darker side of the French Revolution, sorry to disabuse you of sweet thoughts about the French Revolution, it's this dark side of the revolution, the terror, the militarization, the birth of Napoleonic politics that scares many people in Europe. And in the book, I try to sketch out a kind of rough rule that the peoples who experienced direct occupation by French revolutionary troops tended to be turned off representative democracy. The key case is the Russians. They fight the Napoleonic armies, and if you want to trace a key reason why representative democracy never really functioned well in Russia, and why the democratic tradition is so weak until today, it's because they experience democracy in military uniform. The opposite case, it's a great irony, is the British case. Tremendous fear about the French Revolution, and a great uproar, and sailors go on strike, and Tom Paine's Rights of Man becomes a sort of the best-selling pamphlet book, as he said immodestly, since the Bible. And there's fear that actually there will be a revolution in France. It didn't happen for reasons that we know well. And yet it's interesting that the ruling class, the political ruling class in Britain, learns from that experience across the water that unless they reform, unless they begin admitting, legitimizing the people, then there will be a revolution. And so begins a 19th century of British parliamentary Westminster reforms. Great irony. No French occupation, no direct invasion, but a learning that actually to avoid this upheaval, this earthquake, one has to begin, in effect, democratizing an ancient monarchy and without a written constitution.
My final question is also about the 19th century, but a very different part of the world, and something that I think was perhaps the most delightful aspect of the book, and that is Latin America. It really came home to me how little we in cultures like ours tend to know about the history of places like Latin America, because there's a very substantial section of John's book that deals with the emergence of democracy in particularly 19th century Latin America, in tandem with, of course, the achievement of independence for the multiplicity of states that started as colonies of mostly Spain, but of course also Portugal. And the fascinating thing is that in some cases, and there's one particular man who I just want to ask you about in concluding my questions, these people were ahead of their time globally, and so some of the innovations occurring in the 1820s and 1830s in Latin America appear to be well ahead of anywhere else in the world. And there's one particular man I'm interested in, and you'll have to give the correct pronunciation because it's Jose Bache, is it?
Yep.
There you go, I got it right.
Bache.
Oh, that was close. Who was a leader of Uruguay for on and off a couple of decades, I think, close to.
Several presidencies, yeah.
And was a great reformer and a relentless seeker of democratic solutions to the problems of governing a country.
I mean, this again, the standard narratives, the standard treatments of the history of democracy in English usually say nothing about Spanish America. And that's a great shame for all kinds of reasons, because as you rightly say, Lindsay, things happen very early as a consequence of the revolutions against empire. Things happen very early in the new Spanish-American republics. It's very striking that no area in Spanish America opted for monarchy. So they became republics. And this happened from 1810, 1811 onwards, first thing. Second, they all wrote constitutions. And they were remarkably advanced, much more advanced than most places on the face of the earth, in some cases more advanced than that in the United States. Third, there was a struggle for the franchise. Women got the right to vote about 70 years earlier in what is today Colombia than they did in the United States or in Britain. And what's therefore interesting is that these early constitutional republics become caught up in the American process of democratization. So the question of who is entitled to vote, indigenous peoples, male workers, women, all that goes on during the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, and it's a very complicated pattern. But so one thing that can be learned is that a lot of things happen very early. Second thing, I think that's to be learned from, and I try to do it in a very literary way, looking at characters and events and context, is that representative democracy suffered of the kind that survived until the 20s and 30s. I think we're no longer living in representative democracy in territorial state form. Our forms of democracy are different. There's a different trend. But representative democracy of the kind that almost came of age in the 19s and early 1920s and then more or less was smashed before World War II, contained within it something like an autoimmune disease, an illness. And the illness, the degradation that it made possible was that it could give rise to leaders who, in the name of the people, would become modern demagogues. And the example that I give in the book is General Rosas. You've probably never heard of him. If you read nothing in the Spanish America section, have a look at that, because at the end of the 1820s in Argentina, through to the 1850s, General Rosas tries to build the state of Argentina and to use all of the mechanisms of representative democracy, periodic elections, constitution, and so on, in order to empower himself and to produce, in effect, a one-party state, rather like the Jacobin model, where he, General Rosas, governs as he would govern a latifundia, a large cattle ranch, and treat people effectively as cattle. And if you think that's all very antiquarian, I think it later came to bedevil representative democracy, so that in the 1920s and 30s, so here Spanish America is a laboratory, in the 1920s and 30s, all kinds of dictators and demagogues arose, doing things in the name of the people. And in the extreme case, Hitler had a point when he lectured Caspar Koenig in 1933, saying, Chancellor, democracy is a system of government where the people elect a majority and they form a government and they then govern. Contained within the whole principles and practice of representative democracy was this possible degradation, and that happened very early also in Spanish America. Third, there's Bachi and others who, towards the end of the 19th century and during World War I and into the 20s, do really remarkable things by trying to put a stop to this. And what they do is they try to build new institutions to prevent demagogues. And Bachi in Uruguay is, I think, the leading laboratory for this, introduce all kinds of reforms like an election commission that prevents corruption of elections, that tries to weaken presidential power. Presidential forms of government, by the way, are often very bad for democracy because of this demagogic top-down possibility. And Bachi, tries to parliamentarize government, so on. So that's a little bit about Spanish America.
Well, thank you very much, John. I'll now throw it open to the floor for questions. We have roving mics.
When you think of the democracy in the state that brought us Barack Obama, I think that's a very fine thing. It costs millions and millions and millions of dollars to elect that. So we're talking about economic democracy. And it's the point of those that have the gold make the rules. And in this society, the wealth and the media form the opinions of how people vote. But I'd like to go further into Comrade Tanner's political party and mine, and I have a deep respect for his deep beliefs in democracy, which is similar to my own. Is our Labor Party democratic, Comrade Lindsay?
I thought that it was John who was answering
glad
the questions.
you got that
one. I'll answer briefly, then hand over to John. The answer is imperfectly so. I've been involved in campaigning within the Labor Party for many years, on and off, for more democratic internal arrangements. They're better than some parties that I could name. They fluctuate from state to state, from time to time. We've had some problems in recent times in the Victorian branch of the ALP, but mass political parties are a long way from perfect. John.
Thanks. I mean, I'll stand back from Victorian Labour Party politics, which I followed for quite a long time, I have to say. But to say that this book is, among many other things, is an attempt to alert readers, to fill them with a sense of reverence for the simple point that democracy is a highly unusual form of handling power. I'm speaking abstractly, not about Victorian Labour Party politics. And it's unusual because, if you think about it, through its various historical forms, democracy has remained a form of government in which the means of deciding who shall get what, when, and how are publicly owned. Democracy is a form of public ownership of the means of handling power, of making decisions, of reversing decisions, of retaining things, of moving forward. Public ownership. And I tried to write this book so as to avoid and actually dig the boots in to reductionist views of democracy, which have enjoyed popularity rising and falling in recent decades, have a history going back into the 19th century, which says, Marx, that actually all this talk of democracy or democratic institutions are basically rooted ultimately in who owns property. I don't like that, and I think there are a lot of intellectual and political and historical objections to that. Now, having said that, the history of representative democracy, I'll leave out the Greeks and the Syro-Mesopotamians, is a history in which the championing of democracy, of representative democracy, initially comes from propertied classes. I think that's roughly the pattern. And so those who have money and wealth are the champions of the view that actually they need to protect their money and wealth through forms of government that can prevent monarchic despotism where they'll be robbed. And that's fine, except that democracy is about public ownership, the equality principle. And it's in the 19th century that this contradiction between inequality based on wealth and money on the one hand, and public ownership of the means of decision-making on the other, comes to crunch time. And it gives rise to a remarkable mutation called social democracy. The word first appears at the end of the 1830s and early 1840s. I give the example of a Berlin craft worker, journalist, who is among the first to speak about Sozialdemokratie. And it fills a lot of people with fear, rightly so, because it says democracy can only function, public ownership of the means of decision-making and handling power can only function if there is an equalization of wealth and income. And this is the story of the birth of cooperatives and trade unions, the struggle for trade unions, for trade union presses, and the birth of labour parties. And we had the first national Labour Party in the world happened here in Australia. Now, what has become of that tradition of social democracy? It was another, professorial way of putting your question and avoiding Victorian Labour Party politics. But I think the good news is that the 30-year period that resulted in a ginormous bubble, the 30-year period of deregulation, of marketization of the belief that actually more space for markets would make people freer and it would dynamize economies and everybody would be happier, that's, I think, coming to an end. And it's coming to an end for very good reasons. And I would say that your question, the old legacy of social democracy, is now back on the agenda again, because all actually existing democracies, United States, UK certainly, and there's a problem here, are becoming hourglass societies where there is a bottom stratum of people who are left out. Nearly a third of young people in Britain under 18 are living in, officially, statistic, in poverty. That's very bad for democracy. And the losers, and combined with a middle classes are feeling nervous. In Britain, the opinion polls show that for the first time since the 50s, large numbers of middle-class people are worried about the future. They think actually they might become poorer, and they actually have reached the conclusion that their kids will not be better off. And so the property question, the question of income and wealth and distribution comes back. And I think in this sense you can see that the Obama fight for in effect, a socialization of medicine, American style. We're going to witness an almighty battle this autumn in the Northern Hemisphere, and I think it's one of the opening shots in a new politics of redistribution. For democracy, I think it's vital that this question of income and wealth and who gets what, when and how, and dental care and health care and education, all these questions are becoming really, really important. What I worry about is that Labour parties in many parts of the world, I don't mention Victoria, have actually stopped asking this question. And, well, if Obama loses, if there is no healthcare reform in the United States, that's a major setback, I think, for this vision. So, yeah.
Further questions?
I was just wondering about whether you see any, I haven't read your book yet, but whether you see any issues about sort of a return to mercantilism or anything like that with the rise of sort of corporate military and things like that. Because your book's called The Rise and Death of Democracy. I'm wondering whether you see anything in that sort of it. If you understand my question.
Go again. So, a little bit more.
Yeah, well, we're seeing a huge rise in sort of corporate military and outsourcing of military around the world, even through UN and peacekeeping missions and things like that, especially within the United States. And then when you look back on, as you were talking about with India before, with sort of basically trading companies operating in these nations, sort of there's a huge rise of corporations representing basically, making up the top 10 list of countries in the world outside, 3 or 4 of them. So do you see that maybe there's a threat to, and corporations are completely undemocratic, but do you see that there could be a return in the future to sort of more of a corporate-run societies and things like that? I know it sort of borders on the idea of fascism, but sort of because we're outsourcing to corporations and they're becoming so powerful, I was just wondering what your views were on that as a threat to democracy, as part of death to democracy.
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I probably have softer, woollier, more bourgeois views than you about this, but that was a joke that fell flat on its face. I mean, 2 things. About militarization, in the history of democracy, there have been 3 democratic empires: Athens, revolutionary France, and the United States. Britain was not a democratic empire. The whole language of Pax Britannica is to do with Christianization and civilization. Only at the very end is there talk of democratization, and then very reluctantly. And the experience, historical record, shows that democratic empires typically, in the Athenian and French case, get bogged down in deep trouble because it's oxymoronic. I mean, to run an empire and to back it with violence is inconsistent with the principles of open, democratic, egalitarian power sharing. And the United States is faced with, we are living through a long drama. In Europe, I think the feeling is that it's in decline, and probably we're entering now already into an age of bipolarity with China and so on, and so we watch that dynamic. And it has always been, democratic empires have always been a dangerous dynamic, the cause of the death of democracy. That's the haunting thought. As far as corporations are concerned, I mean, I think the way you spoke with respect sounds as if it's the end of the 19th century or early 20th century. It's either the robber barons, it's the big bosses. And there are plenty of those about. But there are corporations and corporations, and there's Microsoft, as well as arms manufacturers. And I don't think you should just lump all of this together. And not only that, but in different regions of the earth, Ralph Dahrendorf many times pointed it out, British capitalism is not German capitalism because of different regulatory systems. This is the point, that democracies have invented ways of regulating corporate power more or less successfully. And it's true that deregulation has been all the flavor of the last several decades. But the post-45 period, this is the qualifier, has seen the erection of institutional barriers and regulatory systems. You may not like them, but they are impinging on corporate power, and the leading one, and I think it's entirely new in the history of democracy, is the Kyoto-Bali-Copenhagen process. Here is a global process which involves the development of new institutional mechanisms for monitoring, scrutinizing the exercise of corporate power, trying to rein in the most destructive effects, the destruction of the biosphere through corporate activities, and trying to find means of making consensus openly without violence. Now, it may all end in tears in Copenhagen. It's not the end. But it's something new in the history of democracy. You could speak, I'll live to regret this, that you could speak about the democratization of corporate power, an instance of the democratization of corporate power in this Copenhagen process. This is new, and we need to think about it with fresh eyes. I don't think we're living in an age in which, unregulated transnational corporate power acts like, a big cigar with boss. There's a lot of that, it's true. But there's also a regulatory framework and a political process, including the involvement of citizens and forms of resistance, like Live 8, like Make Poverty History, that are also new in the history of democracy. It represents a difference from the age of representative democracy because democratic ideals and the attempt to build democratic mechanisms are now creeping across borders because we face a growing number of problems that cannot be handled by territorial states alone. This is new in the history of democracy, and one should cheer up a bit about that.
I'll take one more question as we're getting into the well beyond our time zone, and I think we've had a tremendous evocation of the themes in John's book. So again,
can the Minister for Melbourne be thrown out of a public building?
I probably can.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's one of the aspects of democratic society. Right down the middle,
right.
3/4 of the way at the back.
I'd like you to give advice to Lindsay Tanner on how Australia should elect its first president and what the powers of that president should be.
Yeah, I knew this was coming, and could be the end or the beginning of our friendship. I'm not sure. Well, let me put it this way. I'm coming back to Australia to fight the good fight. I've taken the King Shilling, and I'll be the Professor of Politics at Sydney from next July. And I have a strong interest in reforms and the future of reforms, the strengthening, the reinvigorating of democracy in Australia. We ought to be proud of it, but we also ought to be critical of things, unfinished business. And in my view, I'll be very blunt, the Howard years were bad for democracy, and they bothered me intensely, and I could have lived with only great difficulty here. I think a change of government has been good, but it has put on the agenda, I think, a whole package of possible reforms, of which the Republic is one. I mean, I think probably not to fudge the point or to let you off the hook, but to think, I can think of a couple of handfuls of reforms that are now seriously on the table. I think the reconciliation process, I think, the invention of new mechanisms for saying sorry, much more at the local level with citizens themselves involved, of a politics of shame, a politics of asking forgiveness, an attempt to build some kind of new solidarity with our Indigenous peoples. I think that is crucially important, and that has only just begun. By the way, in the history of democracy, the politics of remembering is something really new since 1945, and the whole truth reconciliation process, it's a Central American invention, famously popularized in South Africa, and we can do a version of that. So that's one element, if you like, in the equation. I think that a Bill of Rights, much discussed recently, is critically important. There is one in ACT, and you have one here in Victoria. A federal version of this would greatly change. I think it would deepen, it would make more complicated democracy in Australia, but it's on balance it will be a very good thing. We come to other reforms. There are a lot of piecemeal changes and strengthening of accountability and integrity of the kind documented in the recent paper by the Anna Bligh government, recently released. I welcome those, because I think one of the great dangers that exists with all actually existing democracies is the disaffection with parties and the decline of party membership and the weakness of Parliament. It's very bad for democracy. It has a certain end of 19th century feel about it. And I think what Anna Bligh has done in this paper is to put on the agenda a kind of spreadsheet where we take stock of what we've achieved and a lot of unfinished business. I think in the field of foreign policy, every democracy has to think carefully about how it's going to live its democracy within a geopolitical framework. And I'm very glad that there is a compass swing that's been going on since the Keating years. Big setback with Howard, big thought that bilateralism all the way with the USA would solve every problem. Fortunately, that's gone, and I think, what multilateralism means and what institution building in the Asia-Pacific region means for Australia is really one of the great political questions. I'd like to see a regional parliament, and of the European Parliament kind. It would really make a difference if China and India and Taiwan, and so, well, Taiwan would be a difficult question, and Indonesia were involved in this. And that leaves the Republic. I think that it's good, it's on the agenda, it's going to happen if the Rudd government is re-elected. There's no doubt about that. There will be a referendum. And I would say, I'm being a bit playful, that one of the positive contributions of Howard to Australian democracy is that he bashed up the referendum last time round, and he gave space and time to actually think about it in a more complicated way and to do it more radically. And that partly means, I think, reassessing our Republican tradition. I'm on record as having said rather unkind things about our Republican tradition. It was macho, it was nationalist, it had a strong fascination with blood and violence, and none of that actually has anything, any role to play, I think, in the 21st century. but the replacement of Queen Elizabeth or Charles by an elected head of state, I think in presidential form is absolutely necessary, but my view is that it ought to be conceived within a wider package of reforms, and that would change the meaning of republicanism. I think the effects of this long, drawn-out resistance to monarchy is probably good for us as Australians. I mean, we straighten our spines, and I hope there will be a great celebration on the day that we know that Charles will be robbed on the finishing line of becoming King of Australia. But don't suppose that that will solve all problems. I think the Republic question, you see, I favour a directly elected version. I think it's more politically viable, actually, because if you put it to Australians that a parliament, pollies, will elect a head of state, that's a turn-off. So a directly elected head of state, yes, but the president, who will have more or less the same powers, might even have fewer powers because all these other changes, if they begin to happen, will actually change the meaning of a president. A president will have to take note of rights, of a Bill of Rights, and will have to play a role in the reconciliation process, and will have to play a role in a new geopolitical framework. I think that's entirely new, and it's certainly not, Henry Lawson's view of what a republic was going to be. I don't know if that helps you or not.
Well, I'm also a direct electionist, but sadly we'll have to bring tonight's conversation to an end, and it's been fascinating, it's been delightful, and I hope everybody present tonight has enjoyed it as much as I have. And I certainly think that it's a tremendous thing that John is returning to Australia, and I've got no doubt that from July next year he'll be making a very substantial contribution to public debate in this country. We've seen a snapshot of it tonight. We've seen snapshots from his book. For those of you who haven't read the book or haven't obtained a copy, I'd certainly recommend it highly to you. Can I thank John particularly for his contribution tonight, everybody else for attending, and can I ask you please to show your appreciation to Professor John Keane. Thank you very much. Have a good night.